Hi Year 12, in this video I'm going to go through a very quick revision of Journey to the North Coast. What I will do in this video is I will give a quick overview of the context, ideas and analysis, but I am a summary, so don't think that the other stuff that you've gone through in class isn't worthwhile. I'm just quickly summarizing some of the material that I think is important in this poem. So the first thing that I want to do is alert you to the context of the poem. The context here is context which is really valuable when talking about all of the poems for Robert Gray. I think that Robert Gray is very much interested or influenced by romantic poetry and romantic ideas and values, which has traditionally been explored in poetry. So Gray is extending the romantic values into the 21st century, into an Australian context. And also, Gray is, as always, influenced by an interest in Eastern spirituality, particularly the emphasis on the natural world as a place where a person can have a spiritual experience. Gray has written that his exposure to Alan Watts, a British philosopher who introduced a lot of the Western world to Eastern spirituality, particularly Buddhism and Taoism, was a significant experience for him, and he conveys the significance of that experience in his own poetry, in the own ideas that he explores. So those ideas then that are explored in Journey to the North Coast are threefold, I think. The first one is that immersing yourself within the natural world can be an exciting experience. For the narrator of this poem, it's an exciting experience because it provides the opportunity for escape from the city, from modern life, modernity. The man-made world is spiritually enervating. That means like draining. Enervate means to drain of life or vitality. And so there's this cynical view of modernity and the man-made world in the city. And in contrast, the natural world provides relief instead. It brings spiritual nourishment, connection with the natural world. So those are three ideas which will come up in the poem. So the first one, though, is the immersion within the natural world can be exciting. Gray does a number of things to convey that excitement in the poem. For instance, he begins with an in media res opening. That means it opens in the middle of things, it opens in the middle of the action. So that's a formal or a structural choice that immediately conveys that sense of excitement. So it begins, next thing, I wake up in a swaying bunk. And beginning with the word next immediately propels the reader forward. There's a lot of forward momentum that happens within this poem that conveys that excitement. Gray is always using language and he's always using structure to mimic the ideas. So the idea here is that the natural world is an exciting place to be immersed within. So the language and the structure reflects that as well. And we get a number of similes as well that suggests a kind of forward movement or a momentum. He's clambering as if on board a clipper clambering at sea, and the train shadow like a bird's flees on blue and silver paddocks. So think about the way that the train then is compared to a boat, being tossed about in the ocean, and the way that a bird kind of quickly or swiftly moves across the sky. These are similes that convey a sense of movement. Gray is very fond of similes. As an imagist, he uses similes a lot to convey his images. But we also get a lot of highly modal verbs throughout the poem. So I've got a couple of them there. Swaying, clambering, booms and cracks, tears, swing, rattle, sways, bursts. All of these are verbs which are littered throughout the poem and accumulate to create this sense of movement, propulsion. And then I've got as well here that there's the intertextual reference. The reference is to the Marcel Duchamp painting Nude Descending a Staircase number 2. And Gray writes in the poem, down these slopes move as a nude descends a staircase, slender white eucalypts. So that's a reference to Duchamp's painting. And Duchamp's painting, if you have seen it before, you will know that it is a study of movement. It's a study of the movement of a body down a staircase. So it's a study of movement. It captures movement in a moment. And that's very much like this poem, that it's trying to capture that sense of movement. So the intertextual reference, as well as the verbs and the simile, creates that sense of movement and momentum. And then finally, the form. A form is always something that you should try to talk about when talking about the poetry. But the form of this poem is kind of different to the other Gray poems. He doesn't use stanza breaks here. The poem is one long poem. It's got fairly short line length, and there's, as I said, there's that lack of stanza breaks. It creates a sense of speed and momentum that matches the poem's idea that immersion within the natural world is exciting. So it's a quick experience. It propels the reader forward, as stanza breaks tend to make readers pause and focus. That's not the case with this poem. Structurally, it's pulled together into one giant sort of stanza. And as I said there, it reflects that idea of the excitement, the energy that comes from being spiritually reinvigorated as part of the natural world. Okay, so another idea that I signaled at the beginning of this video is that Gray suggests that the man-made world is spiritually enervating, that is draining or depleting. So one of the ways that we can think about this, I mean, this is an idea that's conveyed more through inference than explicit. But have a look at the way that the interior world is contrasted with the exterior world. So the exterior world is very colourful, as I said, there's movement, right? But look here at the colour imagery. The blue and silver paddocks, the red bank, the dark creeks, the white eucalypts, all of those are colour images, or, it's colour imagery. And again, that's suggesting the kind of beauty of the natural world, its vibrancy. And in contrast, the interior world of the train is described as drab. So there's sunlight rotating off the drab carpet. So there's a contrast that is immediately established between the natural world and the man-made world through that contrast. But also another thing that I think that suggests that the man-made world is enervating is that we have these connotations of escape. So I've already brought up this simile before, but the train shadow like a bird flees on the blue and silver paddocks. The diction there, the fact that Gray chooses to use that word flees, I think brings to mind the idea of escape. The idea that the narrator of this poem is escaping from something. He's escaping from the city, we later learn. He's escaping from the city into the natural world. And if you're escaping something, you're trying to rid yourself of something. You're finding something is oppressive and you're looking for liberation. So that's an idea that I think is pretty consistent with Gray. It comes out more clearly, I think, with Flames and Dangling Wire, but it's an idea that is still present within this poem. And then I've got there the symbolism of the latches in the straining case that for 12 months have been standing out, that's described at the end of the poem. To me, when I read this poem and I think about that suitcase which has been standing out to him, it's been straining, I see that as symbolic of, the narrator, or indeed all of humanity, our inner desire to find spiritual liberation and reinvigoration through a connection with the landscape, through a connection with nature. So for Gray, he finds that spiritual nourishment in the familiar environment of the Australian landscape. It stands out to him, as it says there in the poem. It calls him home. It's calling him away from modernity into a more natural and spiritually rich way of being. So then the final idea that I've got here in the poem is that the connection with the natural world brings spiritual nourishment. So brings a kind of reinvigoration and a feeling of fulfillment. So one of the ways that I've got that there is that there's this motif of light. Light comes up in, I think, all of Gray's poems, but there's this motif where light is evocative of, or is symbolic of, higher knowledge or spiritual enlightenment. So that's something that comes up in this poem. There's sunlight rotating off the drab carpet, And then later, when he, at the climax of the poem, the sun shines through and the carriage of the train is strewn with flakes of light that make the compartment whirl. And I sort of see that as like the kind of dust inside the train carriage. The sunlight hits it and it looks like there are flakes of light within the train carriage. So we've got this idea of a spiritual fulfillment that's coming, where immersing himself within the natural world, the narrator of this poem is finding a kind of, or is having a spiritual experience. So the motif of light, which symbolizes that spiritual enlightenment. And there are other religious connotations throughout the poem as well. So he says, I see where I'm bowed, one of those bright crockery days from which I recall. But the word bowed there, I think, is an important one. It has connotations of reverence and respect, right? I suppose, we bow or we kneel at the altar. And he's, bowed or kneeled, in front of the window, the train carriage window. So there's a kind of reverential or sacred quality which is bestowed upon the natural environment because of the religious connotations of that word bowed. And whilst he's doing this, he's got the water in front of him. The water sways solidly in its silver bowl, and water is often frequently used as a symbol of purification because it has this religious history of being used in baptism. So, in baptism, it's purifying, but it also provides, it's symbolic of a rebirth. And so we get the idea that becoming immersed within this landscape is a kind of spiritual rebirth, or it's a spiritual purifying experience. And then finally, we've got the alliteration here of I rise into the mirror rested, I'll leave my hair ruffled a bit. And the three R sounds there: rise, rested, ruffled. The alliteration connects the words that suggest the transformative impact of this journey for the narrator. So they are elevated, they're rejuvenated, and they're changed. So that alliteration is the thing that connects together the transformative effects of the journey for the narrator. So that is my very quick summary of Journey to the North Coast. There's plenty more within that poem, and just because it's not included in this video doesn't mean it's not valid, but that's my summary of the ideas and the analysis in that poem.